Emily Jacobs tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she merged onto the highway, her city disappearing behind her in the rearview mirror. The sky was barely beginning to lighten, a soft pink glow spreading over the horizon. Her breath came in slow, controlled waves, but her heart was still racing from the moment she slammed her apartment door for the last time. She glanced at her phone, resting in the cup holder. Greg's name flashed across the screen, the phone vibrating with its persistent hum. Another call. She bit the inside of her cheek and ignored it. There was no point in answering now. He would say the same things he always did, plead with her, promise he would change, make her feel like the one who was abandoning him. But she wasn't abandoning him. She was saving herself. After months of feeling suffocated, trapped, she was finally free. Greg had always been good at making her feel like she was the one at fault. He never yelled. He never hit her. But his words, soft, calm, calculated, left invisible bruises that never healed. He was always there, always in control, always watching. Even when she tried to leave, he had ways of pulling her back. But not this time. Emily exhaled deeply and turned the radio on, filling the silence with music. The rhythmic beat helped her relax, and for the first time in months, she felt the tiniest sliver of peace. She glanced down at the fuel gauge. It was full. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt leading her away from the life she'd known. Away from Greg. For now, at least, she was free. After driving for what felt like hours, Emily spotted a gas station up ahead. The small building sat just off the highway, a neon sign flickering in the early morning light. She hadn't realized how tense she was until she saw the station, her muscles tight, her fingers stiff around the wheel. She hadn't even had coffee yet, and her body was already screaming with exhaustion. She pulled into the gas station and parked beside one of the pumps. The place was quiet, only a single car parked in the lot. Emily rubbed her eyes, trying to shake the sleep from her mind, and stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of gasoline. The station's windows were covered in grime, and the neon sign blinked erratically. It was run down but functional. Emily figured it didn't matter, she wasn't here for luxury, just gas and maybe some caffeine. She filled the tank and walked inside, greeted by the smell of old coffee and the faint buzz of a humming fluorescent light. The attendant at the counter barely glanced at her as she grabbed a bottle of water and some snacks. She paid quickly, feeling an odd sense of relief when she walked back outside. The open air felt cleaner, safer somehow. As she started the car, she noticed another vehicle parked across the lot. A man sat inside, his face shadowed, watching her. Emily's pulse quickened. She glanced back at the road, but when she looked again, the man had turned away, focused on something else. Probably nothing, she told herself. But still, she pulled away quickly, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The man's car didn't follow. The highway opened up before her, the sun now fully above the horizon. Emily leaned back in her seat, her shoulders finally relaxing. She turned the radio up a little louder, hoping to drown out the thoughts that kept creeping into her mind, thoughts of Greg, of the way he'd make her feel guilty for leaving, of the way he'd subtly control her every move. Her phone buzzed again, a quick glance showing another missed call from Greg. Emily pressed her lips together, resisting the urge to throw the phone out the window. How many times could he call? How many times could he try to pull her back? She tossed the phone into the passenger seat, determined to ignore it. But then, in the rearview mirror, she noticed something. A car, distant but familiar. It had been following her for miles. Her throat tightened. Could it be the man from the gas station? She squinted, trying to make out the details, but it was too far back to be certain. No, she told herself. It's nothing. You're just paranoid. But the feeling gnawed at her, a low thrum of unease settling in her chest. She focused on the road ahead, but every few minutes, she checked the mirror again. The car stayed behind her, always keeping its distance but never turning off. Emily's heart beat faster. Why wasn't it passing her? They had been on this empty stretch of road for at least an hour, plenty of time for the car to speed past. But it stayed there, just out of reach, just close enough to make her feel like something was wrong. By the time the sun began to set, Emily's exhaustion had returned in full force. Her eyelids felt heavy, her mind clouded by fatigue and creeping paranoia. She needed to stop. The sight of a rest stop sign felt like a blessing. Emily blinked hard, trying to keep her eyes open as she signaled and pulled into the lot. It was completely deserted, the building dark and lifeless except for a few flickering lights. Her hands shook as she leaned back in her seat, setting the alarm on her phone for an hour. She needed to rest, just long enough to clear her mind before continuing. Her body ached with exhaustion, and within minutes, her eyes fluttered shut. When the alarm jolted her awake, Emily rubbed her face and stretched, feeling groggy but slightly more alert. She needed to use the bathroom before getting back on the road. Her phone buzzed again, Greg's name, the screen lighting up with yet another call. She clenched her jaw, silenced the phone, and stepped out of the car. The rest stop was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights. She made her way inside, the cool air sending a shiver down her spine. The bathroom smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the flickering lights gave the space a dim, unsettling glow. Emily quickly found an open stall and locked the door behind her, eager to get back on the road. She had just sat down when she heard it, a voice. Faint, outside the bathroom door, speaking in low tones. Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't heard anyone enter the building, and her car was the only one in the lot. Before she could process the sound, the bathroom door creaked open. Someone was in here. Emily's pulse quickened. She held her breath, listening as footsteps echoed across the tile floor. Then, a knock, soft but deliberate, on her stall door. Someone's in here, she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. She waited, hoping whoever it was would leave, but the knock came again. This time, slower. Heavier. Emily's stomach clenched as a shadow moved outside the stall door. She could see a figure through the crack, an eye, staring at her. Panic surged through her. The figure outside the door began to mutter something unintelligible, followed by the sound of a head thudding against the door. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, she slammed her body into the stall door, bursting out into the bathroom. The man standing outside, the same man she had seen at the gas station, stumbled back, caught off guard by her sudden movement. She didn't give him a second to recover. Emily bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her ears as she sprinted to her car. She could hear the man shouting behind her, but she didn't look back. She threw herself into the driver's seat and started the engine, her hands shaking so hard she could barely grip the wheel. As she peeled out of the lot, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was standing in the parking lot, watching her, his figure growing smaller as she sped away. Her mind raced. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Was she imagining it? Was she overreacting? Her pulse was still pounding in her ears, her body buzzing with adrenaline. She glanced at her phone. More missed calls from Greg. Emily swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the wheel. She didn't know who that man was, or why he was following her. But one thing was certain, she couldn't stop again. Not until she was far, far away. The car sputtered once, twice, and then went silent. Emily's heart dropped into her stomach as she stared at the blinking fuel gauge. Empty. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel, the dark, desolate highway stretching ahead of her. The engine refused to turn over when she tried again, offering only an ominous click in response. She cursed under her breath. This couldn't be happening. The headlights of the car behind her flickered in the rearview mirror, drawing closer. Emily's throat tightened as the approaching lights grew larger. She didn't recognize the car, it wasn't the one that had been tailing her earlier, but after everything that had happened at the rest stop, every passing car felt like a potential threat. As the car slowed down and pulled to a stop a few yards behind her, Emily's heart raced. Her eyes darted to the phone on the passenger seat, but there was no signal. No way to call for help. She was completely stranded in the middle of nowhere. The car idled behind her for a long moment. She watched in the rearview mirror as the driver's side door creaked open and a man stepped out. He was tall, his figure shadowed in the dim light, and he began walking slowly toward her. Panic surged through her veins. She quickly locked her doors, her mind racing. The windows were already cracked for air, and the hot desert wind brushed against her face as she glanced frantically at the dashboard, willing the car to start again. The man approached her window, stopping just outside. He knocked softly on the glass, leaning down to meet her eyes. "Need help?" His voice was calm, but something about his presence set Emily's nerves on edge. "I'm fine," she managed to choke out, trying to sound confident despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I'm just waiting for roadside assistance." The man tilted his head, his gaze drifting down the empty road before returning to her. "Roadside assistance out here? You're miles from anything." Her pulse quickened. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her fingers still gripping the steering wheel as if it could protect her. "I'll be fine," she repeated, though her voice wavered. The man didn't move for a moment. He stood there, his figure looming in the window's reflection. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. Relief washed over Emily as she watched him drive off, but it was short-lived. She was still alone, still stranded, and her gas tank was bone dry. With a sinking feeling in her chest, she realized she had no choice but to stay where she was until someone else passed by, or worse, until the man returned. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The stillness of the desert night had settled in, broken only by the distant hum of crickets and the occasional whisper of the wind against her window. Emily's eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the highway, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Emily's body tensed. The same car? Another stranger? She couldn't be sure, but her heart started pounding again as the vehicle slowed. This time, the car pulled alongside her, and a different man stepped out. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s, with a salt and pepper beard and worn clothes that suggested he'd been on the road for a while. He approached cautiously, holding his hands up as if to show he wasn't a threat. "Hey there," he called out, his voice steady but kind. "Saw you were pulled over. Everything okay?" Emily hesitated. Her throat felt tight, and her mind screamed not to trust anyone. But what other choice did she have? She couldn't stay here all night. "My car's out of gas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, his eyes scanning the car. "Well, that's no good. I've got a gas can in my truck. I can spare a gallon or two if you need it." Emily stared at him, her instincts warring against each other. Was this another trick? Or was he genuinely trying to help? She swallowed hard and nodded. That would be really helpful, actually. The man gave her a reassuring smile and walked back to his truck. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she watched him retrieve the gas can. Every nerve in her body was on edge, every second that passed making her feel more vulnerable. He returned to her car, unscrewing the cap of the gas can and pouring the fuel into her tank. The smell of gasoline filled the air, and Emily felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she'd be back on the road soon. Maybe she'd finally leave this nightmare behind. "There you go," the man said, screwing the cap back onto the can. "That should get you to the next town. It's about 20 miles down the road." Emily managed a small, tight smile. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." "No problem," he replied, nodding once. "Just be careful out here. Not everyone you meet on these roads is as friendly as me." His words sent a chill down her spine. Before she could respond, he gave her one last look, then got into his truck and drove off, his taillights disappearing into the night. Emily sat there for a moment, staring at the road ahead. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease. The man had helped her, but his parting words lingered in her mind. The car started up again with a rough sputter, the engine groaning in protest as it came back to life. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her grip loosening on the steering wheel. Relief washed over her, though it was tainted by an underlying sense of dread that refused to go away. She pulled back onto the highway, the empty road stretching out before her, illuminated only by the glow of her headlights. Her hands were still shaking, her nerves shot. The exhaustion she'd felt earlier had been replaced by a jittery tension, as if her body couldn't decide whether to relax or stay alert. As the miles ticked by, Emily's mind wandered back to Greg. The missed calls, the texts she hadn't read. Had he sent someone after her? Was he tracking her somehow? It wasn't a completely irrational thought. Greg had always been obsessed with keeping tabs on her, controlling where she went and who she spoke to. But would he really go this far? She glanced at her phone, now showing a sliver of signal. Her finger hovered over Greg's name, but she couldn't bring herself to open the messages. She didn't want to hear his voice, didn't want to see whatever excuses he'd come up with. The headlights in her rearview mirror pulled her attention back to the road. The car from earlier had reappeared, its lights growing brighter as it approached. Emily's heart leapt into her throat, her foot pressing down on the gas pedal instinctively. She couldn't let it catch up to her. Not again. The car drew closer, its headlights filling Emily's rearview mirror. Her pulse quickened, panic bubbling up inside her as she accelerated. She couldn't see the driver's face, but she didn't need to. It was the same car, the same silent pursuit. The same feeling of dread clawing at her insides. Her foot pressed harder on the gas, the engine groaning in protest as the needle crept toward the red. The road ahead was long and empty, stretching into the darkness with no sign of civilization. She had to get away, had to lose him before he got too close. But no matter how fast she drove, the car stayed behind her, matching her speed. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she veered onto a narrow side road, her tires kicking up dust as she sped down the dirt path. The car followed, its headlights bouncing with every bump in the road, but it didn't back off. The dirt road twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the desert. Emily's hands were slick with sweat, her knuckles aching from the tension. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to escape. Suddenly, the road curved sharply, and Emily jerked the wheel to the side. Her tires skidded across the gravel, the car fishtailing wildly before she regained control. The headlights behind her wavered for a moment, but they stayed right on her tail. She was out of time. She couldn't outrun him. Scene 5. The chase begins. Emily's heart raced as she veered off the road entirely, the car bumping and jostling over the rough desert terrain. Dust billowed up behind her, but the other car followed relentlessly, its headlights cutting through the haze. Panic surged in her chest as she scanned the dark landscape for any sign of escape. There were no buildings, no landmarks, just miles of empty desert stretching out in every direction. She couldn't outrun him, and there was nowhere left to hide. With no other option, Emily slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the desert. She threw open the door and bolted into the night, her legs pumping as fast as they could carry her across the uneven ground. Behind her, she heard the screech of tires as the other car came to a stop. The sound of a door slamming shut echoed through the still night, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. Emily didn't dare look back. She ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her muscles burning with the effort. The desert stretched out before her, a vast, empty expanse with no end in sight. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever was following her was gaining ground. Emily's foot caught on a rock, sending her tumbling to the ground. She hit the dirt hard, the wind knocked out of her. Pain shot through her side as she struggled to her feet, but it was too late. The footsteps were right behind her now. Emily scrambled to her feet, her breath ragged as she stumbled through the desert. The rough ground bit at her hands and knees, but she didn't dare slow down. Her lungs burned, and every muscle in her body screamed for relief, but the sound of footsteps behind her kept her going. The man was close, too close. The flashlight beam bounced erratically in the darkness, cutting through the dust that swirled around her. Emily could feel his presence closing in, the steady rhythm of his footsteps echoing in her ears. Panic surged through her, her mind racing with desperate thoughts. She had no plan, no way out. She was trapped in the middle of nowhere with a man who had chased her into the desert. Suddenly, the beam of light swung toward her, and Emily froze. She could see the outline of his figure in the distance, his tall frame moving steadily closer. Her chest tightened as she realized there was nowhere left to run. The darkness around her was vast, and the highway was too far behind her to turn back. She couldn't outrun him. Her eyes darted to the ground, searching for something, anything, to defend herself with. Her hand closed around a jagged rock half buried in the dirt, and without thinking, she swung it with all her strength as the man closed the distance between them. The rock struck his shoulder with a dull thud, and he stumbled back, letting out a grunt of surprise. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it bought her a few seconds. Emily surged forward, throwing herself at him in a desperate attempt to knock him down. They collided with a jarring force, both of them crashing to the ground in a cloud of dust. Emily's head spun as she tried to pin him down, her hands shaking as she struggled to hold him in place. The man twisted beneath her, his body stronger than hers, and in a few swift movements, he had thrown her off. Emily hit the ground hard, her breath knocked out of her. The man loomed over her now, his silhouette towering in the darkness. She could barely make out his features, but the cold intensity in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. "I don't know what you want," Emily gasped, her voice trembling as she pushed herself back, trying to create space between them. "Why are you doing this?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached down, grabbing her wrist with a forceful grip that made her cry out in pain. He wasn't playing games anymore. Whatever he had planned, it was about to happen now. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily twisted her body, slamming her knee into his side. He grunted in pain and let go of her wrist, giving her just enough time to scramble to her feet. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she bolted toward the flashlight that had been thrown aside during the struggle. She grabbed it, turning to face the man who was already getting back on his feet. Her hand trembled as she gripped the heavy flashlight, her mind racing. He was coming toward her again, his expression unreadable in the dark. But this time, she was ready. Without thinking, Emily swung the flashlight with all her strength, connecting with the side of the man's head. The sound of the impact echoed through the still night, and the man staggered, clutching his head as he dropped to his knees. For a split second, Emily stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't believe what she'd just done. But the moment of hesitation was fleeting, her survival instincts kicked in again, and she raised the flashlight, ready to strike if he moved. But the man didn't get up. He slumped to the ground, his body motionless. Emily's chest heaved with each ragged breath as she stood over him, her hands shaking violently. The flashlight slipped from her grip and hit the dirt with a soft thud. She had won. She had stopped him. For the first time since the chase began, Emily allowed herself to breathe. Relief flooded her system, mixing with the adrenaline that still pulsed through her veins. She was alive. She had survived. But then the man groaned, shifting slightly on the ground. He was still conscious, still moving. Panic surged through Emily again. She couldn't let him get up. She couldn't risk him overpowering her, not after everything she had fought through to get here. Her heart raced as she reached down for the flashlight again, her fingers trembling as she gripped it tightly. She stepped toward him, raising the flashlight above her head, her whole body shaking as she prepared to strike. "I don't want to do this," she cried, her voice breaking as the words tumbled out in a desperate plea. But the man didn't respond. He shifted again, groaning in pain as he tried to push himself up from the ground. Emily's panic spiked, and without thinking, she brought the flashlight down with all her strength. The impact was sickening. The man's body went limp, collapsing onto the dirt as a deep silence settled over the desert. Emily staggered back, dropping the flashlight and clutching her chest as her breath came in shallow gasps. She couldn't take her eyes off the man's motionless body, her mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, her pulse thundering in her ears. She had killed him. The man was dead. For a few long moments, she stood frozen in place, her mind reeling as she tried to process the reality of the situation. She had been running for so long, fighting for her life, that she hadn't stopped to think about what might happen when it was over. Now, with the man lying dead at her feet, she was left with a sickening sense of dread. What had she done? Had she overreacted? Had she killed an innocent man? Her eyes flicked to the ground, where the man's phone lay partially buried in the dirt. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she realized that the phone had been recording the entire time. Her stomach twisted as she crouched down to pick it up, her hands trembling. The screen flickered to life, showing a recording that had captured everything: the chase, the struggle, the final moments of violence. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she watched herself swing the flashlight, watched the man collapse to the ground. But as the video played, something else caught her attention. A second recording, a file marked with a date from days earlier, sat at the top of the list. Her pulse quickened as she hesitated, her finger hovering over the file. With a deep breath, Emily tapped the screen, opening the video. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a video of her. Of her leaving her apartment. Of her at the gas station. Of her at the rest stop. Every move she had made in the last few days, all captured on this phone. She was being watched, followed, this entire time. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, a sob of disbelief escaping her lips. This man, he wasn't just some random stranger. He had been sent. Sent by someone who knew her. Someone who had been tracking her every move. Her thoughts spun wildly as she realized the horrifying truth. Greg. This had to be Greg's doing. He had been controlling everything from the start. Emily's mind raced as the pieces started to fall into place. Greg had always been controlling, always watching her, but she never imagined he would go this far. She had left him behind, escaped from his grasp, but somehow, he had found a way to pull her back into his twisted game. Her stomach churned as she looked down at the unconscious man again. Was he hired to follow her? To scare her? She couldn't know for sure, but everything pointed back to Greg. He had always known where she was, always found ways to manipulate her life. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she scrolled through the phone, looking for more clues. Her hand trembled as she opened another app on the man's phone, a tracking app. The map on the screen showed her exact location, her movements traced in a bright red line. He had been following her every step of the way. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process the revelation. She had been running, fighting, surviving, and all the while, Greg had been watching. A cold wave of fear crashed over her as she realized she wasn't safe. Even now, after everything she had been through, Greg was still controlling her. Emily stood up, her legs trembling as she wiped her tears away. She knew she couldn't stay here. She had to keep moving, had to get away before Greg found her again. The desert stretched out before her, vast and empty, but she had no choice but to keep going. The man was unconscious, maybe dead. She didn't know, and she didn't want to stay long enough to find out. Her car was too far back to retrieve without risking being caught, and there was no one out here to help her. With one final glance at the phone, Emily turned and ran. Her heart pounded in her chest as she disappeared into the night, her mind swirling with thoughts of what Greg had done, of what he might still be planning. She wasn't free yet. The chase wasn't over. Emily's legs were shaking by the time she stopped running. She bent over, hands on her knees, gulping air into her burning lungs. The desert night was still around her, an oppressive silence broken only by the whisper of the wind. Her mind raced as fast as her pulse. Greg. His name clanged in her thoughts like a warning bell. Everything she had pieced together, Greg tracking her, sending someone to torment her, pointed to him. He hadn't just been controlling her before she left, he had followed her, orchestrating this nightmare from a distance. Her body shuddered with rage, exhaustion, and a renewed wave of fear. The realization that Greg had been pulling the strings this whole time made her feel sick. She wiped the tears from her eyes, her hands trembling as she glanced at the man's phone. The tracking app, the video files, it was all right there. all the proof she needed to know Greg was behind this. But what could she do now? She couldn't run forever. She couldn't keep hiding, waiting for another one of Greg's pawns to show up and chase her into the wilderness. The fear that had kept her running began to morph into something else, determination. No more running. Emily's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let him control her anymore. She wouldn't let him win. She glanced at the phone's screen again. There was a signal now. She could see Greg's location, a small dot on the map, not far from where she was. He was close. Too close for comfort. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the desperate need to end this. She was going to confront Greg. She was going to put an end to his twisted game. Without another thought, Emily turned and began walking toward the nearest road, her mind racing with the plan forming in her head. The small gas canister the man had left behind barely gave Emily enough fuel to get her car back on the road. The engine sputtered once, making her fear the worst, but then it settled into a low hum as she sped down the highway, her hands tight around the wheel. The desert was dark, the sky an inky black expanse that felt like it was closing in on her. The headlights from her car cut through the night, but every shadow on the side of the road looked like it could be something or someone lurking. She couldn't shake the feeling that Greg had more waiting for her. This was all a setup, it had been from the start. Her eyes flicked to the phone, propped up in the passenger seat, the small dot on the map representing Greg's location growing closer with every passing mile. He was in a cabin, off a narrow dirt road that branched away from the main highway. Isolated. Hidden. It didn't surprise her. Greg always liked to operate from the shadows, always liked to keep his distance while pulling the strings from afar. But this time, Emily was going to confront him directly. She had no plan other than to face him. She didn't care about the danger anymore. She wanted answers. The phone buzzed, snapping her attention back to the screen. Another call from Greg. Her stomach twisted in anger and disgust. How many times had he called her in the last few days? How many times had he tried to manipulate her into coming back, into believing that he was the one she needed? She rejected the call without hesitation and turned down the narrow dirt road, following the winding path toward the cabin. The isolation was palpable as the desert swallowed her up again, but this time, she wasn't running from it. She was heading straight for the heart of the nightmare. The cabin came into view at the end of the dirt road, its silhouette barely visible against the dark horizon. The headlights of Emily's car illuminated the small, run-down structure. It looked uninhabited, quiet, still. But she knew better. Greg was inside, waiting for her. The thought made her skin crawl. She parked the car a few yards away and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle around her. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She had made it this far. There was no turning back now. Emily stepped out of the car, her legs shaky as she walked toward the front door. The desert air was cool against her skin, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath her feet. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The door wasn't locked. It creaked open with a soft groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. Emily's pulse quickened as she stepped inside. The air was stale, the room sparse. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the cabin. There was a table in the center of the room, papers and electronics scattered across it. And sitting at the table, waiting for her, was Greg. He looked up when she entered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He was calm, too calm. "Emily," he said, his voice soft, almost soothing. "I've been waiting for you." Her stomach churned with a mixture of rage and fear, but she forced herself to stand tall, to face him head-on. "Why?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her attempt to remain steady. "Why have you been doing this? Why did you send someone after me?" Greg leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he regarded her with that same unsettling smile. "You've always been so fragile, Emily. So easy to manipulate." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I wasn't going to let you leave me. Not like that. Her heart raced, anger boiling to the surface. "You sent someone to chase me, to attack me." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, Emily. I didn't need to send anyone. You did all of that yourself." The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. What did he mean? She had been chased. She had been stalked. The man in the desert, she had fought him, killed him. But Greg's smirk remained fixed, calm in the face of her confusion. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Greg stood up slowly, his movements deliberate as he walked toward her. "You were always paranoid, Emily. Always jumping at shadows, always thinking someone was out to get you. I just gave you a little push." Her blood ran cold as his words sank in. She stepped back, her mind racing to catch up. "You set me up," she breathed, her voice shaking. "You made me think I was being followed. You made me." "I made you doubt yourself," Greg interrupted, his tone light, conversational. "Just like I always have. You've never been able to see things clearly, Emily. That's why you needed me. I kept you safe from your own mind." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The rage that had simmered beneath the surface boiled over, and before she could stop herself, she lunged at him. Her hands collided with his chest, shoving him backward with all the strength she could muster. "You ruined my life," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You manipulated me. You twisted everything until I didn't know what was real." Greg staggered back but didn't fall. He straightened, that same infuriating smirk still on his face. "And look where it's gotten you," he said, his voice soft. "You're here, in the middle of nowhere, chasing ghosts." Emily's hands were shaking uncontrollably now, her vision blurred with tears of rage and frustration. She could feel herself spiraling, her thoughts becoming jumbled, incoherent. Greg had done this to her. He had twisted her mind, made her question everything. She glanced around the cabin, her breath coming in shallow gasps. There had to be something, anything, that she could use to fight back. Her eyes landed on a heavy lamp on the table. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it at Greg. He dodged the first blow, but she was relentless. The second swing connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward into the wall. His smirk faltered for the first time, and Emily felt a surge of grim satisfaction. But Greg wasn't done. He recovered quickly, pushing her back with surprising strength. Emily's back hit the table, knocking papers and electronics to the floor. She gasped for breath, her mind racing, her body trembling with fear and fury. "You've always been a mess, Emily," Greg said, his voice low and menacing. "You can't function without someone to control you. And now, you've completely lost it." Emily's head spun as his words cut deep. She had been manipulated for so long that she didn't know what was real anymore. But there was one thing she knew for sure: Greg wasn't going to control her anymore. With one final surge of strength, Emily shoved him with all her might, sending him crashing to the floor. He hit his head on the edge of the table with a sickening thud, his body slumping into an unnatural position. Emily stood over him, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. For a moment, everything was still. Greg lay motionless on the floor, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. It was over. She had won. But as she looked down at his body, the sickening realization began to sink in. What had she done? Emily stood frozen, her chest heaving with ragged breaths as she stared down at Greg's lifeless body. The cabin was eerily quiet, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her hands were trembling, slick with sweat, as she dropped the lamp onto the floor with a heavy thud. It clattered against the wood, and the noise seemed to echo endlessly in the stillness. Greg's body lay motionless, crumpled at an odd angle where it had fallen. A thin trail of blood seeped from the wound on his forehead, staining the floor beneath him. The sight of it made Emily's stomach churn. She had fought so hard to escape him, to end his control over her life. And now she had killed him. But the relief she expected didn't come. Instead, a wave of nausea crashed over her, and she stumbled back, her legs shaking so badly that she collapsed into the nearest chair. Her mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. Was this it? Was it finally over? For a moment, Emily allowed herself to believe that it was. She had confronted Greg, fought back, and stopped him from tormenting her ever again. But as her breathing slowed and the initial adrenaline began to wear off, another feeling crept in, something cold, something that gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. She glanced around the cabin, her eyes landing on the papers and electronics scattered across the floor from their earlier struggle. Her gaze fell on Greg's phone, and a sickening sense of dread washed over her. What had he been planning? How deep did his manipulation go? Her hands were still shaking as she picked up his phone, her thumb swiping across the screen to unlock it. She had to know. Emily's fingers trembled as she navigated through Greg's phone, each tap of the screen bringing a fresh wave of anxiety. Her breath quickened as she scrolled through his messages, his emails, and the files stored on the device. What she found made her blood run cold. There were recordings. Dozens of them. Each one meticulously documenting her every move. Every time she had doubted herself, every moment of paranoia, every phone call and frantic voicemail she had left for Greg over the past few weeks, it was all there, captured and catalogued in chilling detail. Her throat tightened as she played one of the recordings. The sound of her own voice, shaking, desperate, filled the cabin, echoing off the walls. It was a recording from weeks ago, when she had called Greg in a panic, convinced that someone had been watching her. "I don't know what's real anymore, Greg," her voice crackled through the phone. "I think I'm losing my mind. Please, just tell me what to do." The raw vulnerability in her own words made Emily's stomach twist. She had been at her lowest point, her mind unraveling under the weight of Greg's manipulation, and he had recorded it. Every cry for help, every breakdown, he had saved them, weaponized them. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob as she scrolled through the other files. It wasn't just phone calls. There were videos too, footage of her at the gas station, at the rest stop, even at her own apartment. He had been tracking her movements, watching her, playing with her mind until she didn't know what was real. She dropped the phone onto the table, her whole body shaking. Greg had planned everything. Even this, her confrontation with him, had been part of his twisted game. He had known she would come. He had known she would snap. And now it looked like she had lost control. She stared down at Greg's body, her vision blurring with tears. What had she done? Had he manipulated her into killing him? Had this been his plan all along? The phone buzzed, startling her from her thoughts. Emily glanced down, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the notification on the screen. Video recording, active. Her breath caught in her throat. No, it couldn't be. With shaking hands, she picked up the phone and tapped the notification. The screen flickered to life, showing the live feed from a hidden camera in the cabin's corner. It had been recording everything, the confrontation, the struggle, the moment she had hit Greg with the lamp. Every second of it had been captured. Greg had set her up. He had recorded the entire thing, twisting the narrative to make her look like the aggressor, the one who had lost her mind. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. No one would believe her. They wouldn't see the years of manipulation, the psychological abuse. All they would see was the final act, her killing Greg in cold blood. Emily's head was spinning, her thoughts a jumbled mess as she stumbled toward the door of the cabin. She had to get out. She had to run. But as her fingers grasped the doorknob, she heard it, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Sirens. Panic surged through her, and she backed away from the door, her heart racing. Someone had called the police. Or maybe Greg had set this up too. Maybe the police had been waiting, just like everything else. She couldn't think straight. She couldn't breathe. The sirens grew louder, closer, and Emily's mind spiraled into chaos. What was she going to do? How could she explain this? She had killed Greg, and there was a video to prove it. No one would believe her story about his manipulation. No one would understand the hell he had put her through. Her pulse raced as the sound of gravel crunching outside signaled the arrival of the police. She could hear voices now, muffled but urgent, as they approached the cabin. Emily's chest tightened with fear, her back pressed against the wall as if she could disappear into the shadows. The front door creaked open, and 2 officers stepped inside, their flashlights sweeping across the room. They saw Greg's body first, lying motionless on the floor. Then, their eyes found her wide-eyed and trembling in the corner. One of the officers said cautiously, his hand hovering near his holster. "Put your hands up. Now." Emily's mind was reeling, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she stared at them. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The reality of what had happened, of what she had done, was crashing down around her, suffocating her. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. He made me do it." But the officers didn't seem to care. One of them stepped forward, his handcuffs ready as he approached her. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her eyes darting from the officers to Greg's body, to the phone still recording everything. They wouldn't believe her. No one will. The officer's hand closed around her wrist, cold metal snapping against her skin as the handcuffs clicked into place. Emily's mind raced, her pulse quickening as panic overtook her. She wanted to explain, to scream, to tell them everything Greg had done, but the words stuck in her throat. She was being led outside now, the cold night air biting against her skin as the officers guided her toward the police car. The flashing lights cast eerie shadows across the desert, the cabin growing smaller and smaller behind her. As they placed her in the back of the police car, Emily's gaze drifted back toward the cabin, where Greg's body still lay on the floor. The weight of it all pressed down on her like a crushing force. Everything she had fought to escape, everything she had tried to stop, had led her here. The door to the police car slammed shut, and Emily was left alone in the darkened back seat, her thoughts spiraling. How had it come to this? How had Greg managed to control her even in death? Tears blurred her vision as the car began to pull away, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. She wasn't free. She would never be free. Months later, Emily sat in a stark white room, the walls cold and bare around her. The sterile scent of the mental institution clung to the air, a constant reminder of where she was. The memories of that night still haunted her, playing on a loop in her mind. Greg's face. The blood. The recording. No one had believed her story. The video had shown everything, her breakdown, her attack, Greg's calm demeanor up until the moment she had killed him. It was all the evidence they had needed to label her unstable, to lock her away. They hadn't seen the manipulation, the years of abuse, the mind games Greg had played. They hadn't cared about the truth. All that had mattered was the video. Emily stared out the small window, her thoughts numb. She had thought that by killing Greg, she would free herself from him, but instead, he had trapped her in a different kind of prison. One she could never escape. As she sat in the silence of her room, her heart heavy with the weight of her fate, she heard it. A knock. Faint at first, but persistent. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the door, her pulse quickening. The knock came again, louder this time. Her hands shook, her mind reeling. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But the knock came again, rhythmic and insistent, and Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. Her heart raced, the sound of the knocking filling her ears, her thoughts. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out, but the knocking continued, growing louder with each passing second. The nightmare wasn't over. It never would be.